What if the success you're chasing is quietly costing you the very thing that makes life worth living? We don't usually stop to ask that. Not when things are going well, not when the paycheck clears, when the title sounds impressive, when people are clapping for us. Because from the outside, everything looks right. You go to school, get the degree, land the job, you build the resume, you hit your goals. And somewhere along the way, you learn how to smile through exhaustion, how to say I'm fine even when something inside feels strangely absent. At first it's subtle. You brush it off, you keep moving. Maybe you lose interest in the things you once loved. Maybe your laughter doesn't feel quite real anymore. But hey, you're successful and success means fulfillment. Right. That's the story we're told. But what if the story's broken? What if in the process of becoming what the world wanted, you drifted away from who you really are? This video is not about giving up on ambition. It's not about retreating from the world. It's an invitation to pause, to question, to look beneath the surface and ask, have I built a life I perform or a life I truly live? Because true success doesn't start with applause, it starts with honesty. And that's where our journey begins. They tell you to go after success, not in whispers, but in loud celebratory slogans. Dream big, hustle harder. You can be anything. From a young age, those words get stitched into our identity, like branding on a product being prepared for the marketplace. And so you follow the script. You check the boxes, grades, college internship, the job that sounds respectable, the promotions that make your parents proud. You do what it takes to be seen, to be recognized, to be admired. And to the world, it looks like you're winning. But inside, something small begins to fracture. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, subtly, almost invisibly. You don't feel it at first. You're too busy. You're adjusting, adapting, succeeding. But one day you catch yourself in the mirror, not the literal one, but the emotional one, and you don't quite recognize the person staring back. Not because you've changed, but because somewhere along the way you stopped being you. And that's the part no one talks about. See success the way we've been taught to define. It doesn't demand your soul all at once. It takes it in small pieces. A compromise here, a silenced instinct there, a choice made out of obligation instead of alignment. And over time, you don't even realize what you've lost. Carl Jung warned about this. He didn't write books about climbing ladders or building empires. He spoke of the soul, of individuation, of becoming whole. For Jung, the real danger wasn't failure. It was success without self. And that's what's happening to so many of us. We're not just building careers, we're constructing elaborate identities, polished personas, personality versions custom-made to survive the world we've entered. We learn to talk a certain way in meetings, to downplay certain opinions, to shrink our emotions so we seem professional. We show up not as ourselves, but as avatars designed to be accepted. And it works. People like us. They trust us. They promote us. But deep down, we know it's not really us they're connecting to. It's the mask. And that creates a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It's the kind of emptiness that appears in quiet moments in the middle of the night during a long drive, or right after achieving something big and still feeling nothing. That's the cost. Success in its conventional form often becomes a trade. You give the world what it wants. In return, the world gives you applause. But the price is your truth. And the truth is not loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't post status updates. It whispers. It sits quietly in your gut while everyone else is cheering. You might find yourself surrounded by people who admire you, but none of them really know you. And the truth is, you may not know yourself either. Because when your worth becomes measured by output, by productivity, by how seamlessly you fit into a system, you start to forget how to simply be. Be messy, be uncertain, be real. But being real doesn't pay bonuses. It doesn't get you the corner office. It doesn't make your LinkedIn feed glow. So instead, we learn to perform. We perform competence. We perform confidence. We perform happiness. And what's tragic, what's deeply tragic, is that this performance becomes so good, so convincing, that even you start to believe it until you don't, until the cracks show up in the form of burnout, or anxiety that doesn't have a name, or relationships that feel like cardboard cutouts, pleasant, polite, but hollow. That's the soul trying to speak. That's your inner world knocking on the walls of your polished life saying, "This isn't it. I miss you." The modern world gives us many tools to build outward success, but very few to preserve our inward wholeness. We're taught how to manage teams, but not how to manage our thoughts. We're taught how to network, but not how to connect. We're taught how to get ahead, but not how to return home to ourselves. And maybe that's why so many people are quietly struggling, because we've been running so fast for so long toward goals we were told mattered that we never stopped to ask, do these goals reflect who I really am? And that question, when finally asked, can feel like an earthquake, because it shakes the very ground your identity was built on. But here's the paradox: that earthquake is also an opening, a crack in the mask, a moment of radical honesty. And from there, from that precise point of disillusionment, a deeper kind of success can begin. Not the kind that's measured in followers' trophies or job titles, but the kind that's felt in your chest, in your breath, in the quiet peace of knowing that you are no longer betraying yourself for applause. We live in a world obsessed with certainty. From the moment we step into the education system, we're taught that there's a clear formula for a good life. Get good grades, get into a respectable college, choose a realistic major, find a stable job, buy a home, climb the ladder, retire comfortably. Everything is mapped out like a GPS route, clean, linear, approved. And it works. On paper. But here's the thing no one tells you. Just because the path is paved doesn't mean it's meant for you. In fact, many people follow that path to the letter and still wake up one day with a sense of quiet panic. Not because something went wrong, but because everything went right. They did all the right things, and still they feel wrong. That's the paradox of modern success. You achieve what you're supposed to, and yet instead of feeling whole, you feel hollow. Instead of feeling proud, you feel disconnected. You stand in the home you worked so hard to afford, drive the car you once dreamed of, carry the job title that impresses strangers, and wonder why it all feels like someone else's life. This isn't a failure. It's not a weakness. It's the natural result of walking a path designed by someone else's values. Because when you build a life based entirely on what the world tells you matters, there comes a point when your soul steps in and whispers, "But what about me?" Carl Jung called this the moment of psychic misalignment, when the outer life no longer reflects the inner truth. It doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly through small, unconscious betrayals. You accept the job offer, even though a voice deep inside said it wasn't right. You nod in agreement during meetings, even when something in you wanted to speak up. You smile through situations that don't feel authentic because it's easier than rocking the boat. And slowly, day by day, a split occurs. There's the version of you that the world sees competent, agreeable, successful. And then there's the version of you that lives quietly underneath, confused, restless, barely breathing. This split is dangerous, not because it's dramatic, but because it's invisible. It goes unnoticed, unspoken. You remain functional. You meet deadlines. You hit your metrics, so no one asks if you're okay, not even you. Because how can you question a life that looks good? How do you explain a kind of sadness that doesn't come from any specific tragedy, but from a slow erosion of meaning? This is the emotional estrangement that so many people live with, the sense that they're drifting through their own life like a guest playing a role that was assigned to them, not chosen. And the most haunting part is, at some point they forget what their own voice even sounded like. They forget what lit them up. They forget the thrill of curiosity, the fire of intuition, the weightless joy of doing something simply because it felt right, because those parts were slowly trimmed away to fit the mold. Modern culture doesn't reward internal alignment. It rewards performance. It praises results. It values consistency over authenticity. And so we learn to conform, not because we're weak, but because it's expected, because it's what keeps us safe, liked, included. But there's a cost to that safety. The cost is you. You begin to live a version of life that looks like everyone else's highlight reel and feels like none of your own truth. You wake up with the nagging sense that something's missing, but you can't put your finger on what. You're constantly fine, but never quite free. You laugh, but there's no spark. You succeed, but there's no satisfaction. And maybe the most painful part, you start to believe that this is normal. That numbness is the price of adulthood. That restlessness is just a part of being human. That emotional emptiness is the natural consequence of responsibility. But it's not. It's the consequence of living a life that was never truly yours to begin with. You weren't born to fulfill a checklist. You weren't born to fit into a model that ignores your instincts, your passions, your inner compass. The paths society hands us may work for some, but they are not sacred. They are not universal. They are not you. And the truth is, if you don't question the path you're on, you may reach the end and realize you climbed the wrong mountain. Jung reminds us that individuation, the process of becoming whole, starts with self-awareness. It starts with the courage to ask, whose dream am I chasing? Whose values am I living? Whose voice have I mistaken for my own? Those questions are uncomfortable. They stir the still waters, but they also open the door to freedom. Because once you begin to see the misalignment, you can begin to choose again. You can begin to reimagine success not as external achievement, but as internal congruence. Not as applause, but as peace. Not as fitting in, but as finally feeling at home within your own skin. And that kind of success, the kind that honors who you truly are, doesn't require a map. It requires honesty, it requires intention, and most of all, it requires the courage to leave behind a version of life that was never really yours, in order to reclaim the one that is. Carl Jung never saw success as the world does. He didn't write about goals, profits, or public approval. He didn't measure life by milestones, by how fast one could climb or how much one could accumulate. For Jung's success was not about rising higher. It was about sinking deeper into yourself. Because true success, in the Jungian sense, is not the conquering of the world. It is the preservation of the soul in a world that constantly asks you to abandon it. That's a radical thought in today's culture. In a world that equates success with constant motion, more doing more, building more, becoming Jung's voice cuts through the noise with a quiet truth. It doesn't matter how far you go if you lose yourself along the way. And yet that's exactly what so many of us are doing. We're chasing images of success that look perfect from the outside: job titles, accolades, polished lives, but come with a silent trade, the compromise of inner integrity. And we rarely notice that trade right away. In fact, in the beginning, it feels like winning. You're getting ahead, you're being praised, you're achieving what you set out to do. But something subtle begins to shift. You start to say things you don't quite believe. You start to agree to things that don't feel aligned. You begin making decisions not because they feel right, but because they make sense or look good. And then one day, without fanfare or warning, you realize you don't feel connected to your own life anymore. You've succeeded, but not as you. You've built something, but you're not in it. You've moved forward, but left pieces of yourself behind. That's what Jung meant by the fragmentation of the soul. It doesn't happen in big dramatic moments. It happens in small, repeated concessions, the kind that erode your center just enough to make you doubt it was ever there. You become what the world rewards, but you lose what made you whole. And that's the tragedy hidden beneath so many successful lives. Because when you lose your inner alignment, it doesn't matter how shiny the surface becomes, something essential inside you goes quiet. You may not even be able to name what's missing, but you feel it in the silence of your own company, in the moments between accomplishments, in the spaces where joy should live but doesn't. And what makes this even more painful is that the world keeps applauding. No one sees what you've lost. No one questions your performance. No one asks how your soul is doing, because from the outside you're doing great. So you keep performing, and it gets harder to stop. Because stopping would mean facing the truth, that your outer life and inner self have grown miles apart. That somewhere in the race to prove yourself, you abandoned the most important part of you, the part that didn't need to be earned or validated, the part that was always enough. Jung called this the crisis of authenticity. It's the moment when you realize that external success has become an empty shell, a house with no warmth, no soul, no life inside. And that realization is terrifying, because it forces a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What if the version of me the world loves isn't really me at all? But here's the gift buried inside that question: the opportunity to return. Because the soul doesn't disappear, it waits. Even when it's silenced, even when it's exiled, it waits patiently, quietly for you to come back. And when you do, when you begin to listen again, something extraordinary happens. Not suddenly, not easily, But unmistakably, you start to feel alive again, not because life gets easier, but because you're finally living it as you. You start to feel present in your own story, no longer watching it unfold from a distance. You begin to speak in your own voice and hear it echo back with truth. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole. It's not about self-improvement, it's about self-remembering. It's about coming home to the parts of you that were never broken, only buried. And here's the paradox. That journey inward toward your own integrity may not look like success to the outside world. It may involve saying no to things that once defined you. It may disappoint people who benefited from your performance. It may cost you status, comfort, applause. But what you gain in return is something the world cannot give and cannot take away: inner peace. The peace of knowing you are no longer divided inside. The peace of waking up each day and recognizing the person in the mirror. The peace of living a life that belongs to you completely, unapologetically, and wholeheartedly. And in the end, that's the only success that truly matters. It's easy to assume that any critique of success is a rejection of ambition, that to question the pursuit of status, achievement, and goals is to abandon drive altogether. But this is not about escaping life. This is about returning to it fully, consciously, and as yourself. Because success in and of itself isn't the problem. The problem is when success demands a trade you were never meant to make. The problem is when in the process of becoming someone you forget who you already were. We live in a culture that rewards performance over presence. We're praised for what we produce, admired for what we project, and measured by how well we meet expectations, not by how deeply we live in truth. And in this system, it becomes dangerously easy to drift. You follow the steps, you play the part, you do everything right. But somewhere along the journey, you stop asking the most important question of all. At what cost? At what cost did you get here? What parts of yourself did you suppress to keep the peace? What dreams did you bury because they didn't make sense to others? What truths did you hide because they didn't fit the image? It's a haunting realization that the version of you who succeeded might have done so by silencing the version of you who was real. But the world applauds the outer result. It doesn't ask about the inner sacrifice. No one stops to wonder, what if the cost of your success was authenticity? What if the image you built came at the price of your aliveness? This is not a call to throw everything away. It's not about quitting your job, renouncing material life, or rejecting every goal. This is about reclaiming your center. Because somewhere beneath the image, beneath the achievements and applause, there is a version of you who remembers, a version who never needed to prove anything, a version who didn't measure worth in output or status, a version who once dreamed without editing, loved without calculation, and moved through the world not with strategy, but with sincerity. And that version is still here, waiting for you to pause long enough to listen, to ask not just what you've gained, but what you've lost. Because when we stop living from our center, we begin to navigate life like actors on a stage, convincing, charismatic, but ultimately disconnected. We forget how to say no, not because we agree, but because we fear being seen as difficult. We forget how to rest, not because we're lazy, but because we've tied our value to productivity. We forget how to feel, not because we're numb, but because feeling might disrupt the image we built so carefully. And so we become functional, but fractured. We keep moving, but we're no longer moved. And here's the paradox. The world will continue to reward the version of you who performs, even as it quietly starves the version of you who is real. So at some point you have to make a choice, not between success and failure, but between performance and presence, between applause and alignment, between looking successful and being whole. And that choice begins with one brutally honest question. Who did I have to stop being to get here? Did you stop being the artist, the lover, the seeker, the one who needed space to feel deeply, who once said what they meant, who once allowed life to touch them? Did you stop being curious, soft, spontaneous, wild? And if so, was it worth it? Because even if the world says yes, even if your resume sparkles and your life looks polished, only you can answer that question. Only you can feel the weight of what's missing, the invisible loss that doesn't show up on balance sheets or Instagram feeds. And here's the truth that most people don't want to hear. Sometimes what we call success is just a well-marketed form of self-abandonment. And the further you drift from yourself, the harder it is to remember how to come home. But coming home doesn't mean rejecting everything you've built. It means returning to it with different eyes. It means asking, can I stay in this life and still stay true? Can I pursue goals without losing my soul? Can I move forward without moving away from myself? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the structure can hold your truth, but sometimes it can't. And in those moments, you are asked to choose between the comfort of the familiar and the discomfort of being real. That's the moment of reclamation. That's when you stop chasing the life that looks good and begin living the one that feels true. That's when you remember success isn't about never making sacrifices. It's about knowing which sacrifices are too high a price to pay. You can lose money and recover. You can lose status and rebuild. But when you lose yourself, really lose yourself, the road back is long. Not impossible, but costly in its own right. So before you go any further, ask yourself, is the life I'm building big enough to hold my truth? Is the success I'm chasing rooted in who I am or in who I've been told I should be? And most of all, what would it look like to live not as a brand, not as a projection, but as a full, unfiltered human being? That question won't give you easy answers, but it will give you something better. It will give you yourself. And that is the one thing worth never losing again. This is not a message of surrender. It is not a sermon against ambition, success, or growth. It's not telling you to throw away your goals, quit your job, or run to the woods and renounce society. This is something far quieter and far braver. It's an invitation to pause, not to quit, not to give up, but to redirect. To step off the treadmill just long enough to ask yourself, am I moving forward or am I simply moving? Because there comes a point in every journey when momentum is no longer clarity, when speed becomes a form of distraction. When you realize you've been so focused on the next step, the next achievement, the next win, that you haven't looked inward in a very long time. And that's where the real disconnection begins, not in chaos, but in routine. Not in failure, but in silent success. Not in breakdown, but in numbness. Because there's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard, it comes from working too long against yourself. And maybe you know that feeling. You wake up in the morning and everything's fine. You go through the motions, meet your deadlines, smile at the right moments. From the outside, your life is functional, respectable, even enviable. But something is missing. Not something you can name. Not something others can see, but you feel it like a faint ache behind the rib cage. Like a question you can't quite articulate that keeps whispering at the edges of your busy mind. And here's the part that hurts. You've built so much. You've worked hard. You've sacrificed time, comfort, sometimes even parts of yourself for the life you now have. But when you stop even for a second and really listen, you're not sure it's yours. Not because you didn't choose it, but because you chose it at a time when you didn't fully know who you were. That's what this pause is about. It's not a collapse. It's not a breakdown. It's a moment of radical honesty, the kind that doesn't scream but sits quietly inside you like a soft revolt. And if you've felt that inner unrest even faintly, you are not alone. More people than you know are quietly carrying the same questions. Living in houses they can't feel at home in. Wearing smiles that feel more like masks. Succeeding in lives that no longer feel aligned. They're not broken. They're not lost. They're awakening. Awakening to the fact that they've spent years building a life that checks every box except the one labeled truth. And truth is not always efficient. Truth doesn't care about how things look on paper. It doesn't reward you for being likable, promotable, productive. It cares about alignment, integrity, depth. And when you stray too far from it, even if everything else seems fine, you'll feel it. In the stillness between tasks, in the conversations that don't land, in the success that somehow feels strangely empty. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And this pause, this ache, this gentle confusion is often the beginning of that consciousness. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something finally wants to be made right. So if you felt disconnected, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent way, this video is speaking to you. It's not giving you answers. It's not offering a formula. Because real transformation doesn't work that way. It begins in the silence, in the brave private decision to stop performing long enough to ask, what part of me have I silenced to become who I am today? It begins in the uncomfortable realization that applause doesn't equate to peace. That achievement doesn't guarantee meaning. That being admired is not the same as being known. And from that realization, if you're willing to stay with it, something new can be born. Not a new career necessarily, not a new lifestyle or relationship, but a new center, a reclaimed axis, where your choices begin to come from your truth, not your conditioning, where your time reflects your values, not just your responsibilities, where your voice becomes your own again, not an echo of what the world wants to hear. This isn't the end of your journey. It's a redirection, a turn inward before continuing outward, a realignment with the self you left behind, not because you were weak, but because the world taught you to prioritize survival over sincerity. But now you get to choose again. And maybe this time the success you build won't just be admired, it will be felt. Deep in your bones, in your breath. In the moments you stand alone and feel full, not because of what others see, but because you finally see yourself. So take the pause, breathe. You're not failing, you're listening. And in a world that constantly tells you to keep going, sometimes the most radical act of growth is to stop and start again, but from you. In a world that constantly pushes you to do more, prove more, and become more, it's easy to forget the most important thing, staying connected to who you truly are. We've been taught to chase success as if it's the ultimate measure of our worth. But what no one tells us is that unchecked ambition can quietly lead us away from ourselves. This isn't a call to give up your dreams, it's a reminder to make sure they still belong to you. So here's the invitation, take a pause. Not a retreat, not a breakdown, but a conscious moment to ask yourself, is the life I'm building aligned with my truth, or am I just fulfilling a role? When you make choices from your center, success feels different. It's quieter, but deeper. It's not about impressing others, it's about recognizing yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and feeling peace. And in today's noisy world, that kind of clarity, that's the rarest and most valuable success of all.